Good evening. Welcome to everyone who's here with us and everyone who's here with us virtually. We're very glad to have you for this evening. My name is Colette Bancroft. I'm the book editor at the Tampa Bay Times. And more importantly, this evening, I have been for about 20 years a student of Rose Marie Prins, who is a brilliant and accomplished artist in her own right, and a wonderful, incomparable teacher. And over the years of taking her classes, I've also become, I hope, her friend. And we're here tonight to talk about her, an unusual project for her, one that she completed this year, a book called A Leaf in the Wind. She collaborated, in effect, on this book with her son, who died suddenly in 2016. And the book is both a sort of a tribute to him, a memorial to him, and a story of his life. And I was thinking about the book, of course, over these last couple of weeks, and at the same time, as part of my job, I was putting together, as I do every year, a list of my favorite books of the year. And it occurred to me that my very favorite book this year, far and away, is a novel by Maggie O'Farrell called Hamnet. That's Hamnet with an N. Spell check will keep telling you it's Hamlet, but it's not. But it is. It's a novel about the son of William Shakespeare, whom we know very little about, but his name was Hamnet, and he died at the age of 11 in 1596. And that's really about all we know about him, except that about 4 years later, Shakespeare premiered in London a play called Hamlet. And the book is not really about Hamlet himself, who dies early in the book, and it's not really about Shakespeare, who's never named in the book. He's called the Latin tutor, or the father. But it's about Shakespeare's wife, Hamlet's mother. And it's a heartbreaking and beautiful book. And one of the things it's about is how grief shatters us. And another thing it's about is how art can put us back together. And I realized that that book has a lot in common with this book, which is about putting yourself back together after grief. And so tonight, Rose Marie and I are going to talk about the book, why she did it, what she did, and about her son. And Bob Devin Jones, who needs no introduction, the amanuensis and raconteur of Studio at 620 is going to read some of the poems from the book. But first, Rose Marie, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how the poems came to you that were written by your son.
That was a very fortuitous event, because of course without his widow deciding that she was going to simply mail this great big envelope to me from Canada, I would not have had these poems. Over the years, very occasionally, Jaro would email me a poem that he'd written, but they were sporadic. This was a big fat envelope of his writings, both his poetry and his prose. And so I was able to go through it and select the pieces that seemed to make sense in terms of the theme of this book. And initially I thought I was going to write a triptych. It was going to be 3 books. But after doing one, this is it. But I'm very grateful that his widow sent me these poems.
Yeah, and you didn't really know many of them existed. It was a surprise to you when she sent them.
It was an absolute surprise to me, yes, because not only did she send the poems, but she also sent his journals. So I had his meditations and his thoughts and his contemplations as a backdrop to the poetry, which was really enlightening and moving, of course. So yeah, I'm still very grateful to her.
Yeah, I was interested as I read the introduction to the book. I knew about your son from your talking about him over the years, and I met him a couple of times, and he was charming and smart and just a wonderful person to be around. But I didn't know him well, certainly. I met him just a couple of times. But I learned when I read the introduction to the book about his life and the difficulties that he faced. And it intrigued me that when he was young, in his teens, early 20s and teens, three things sort of converged. He had a kind of spiritual awakening and was drawn particularly to Buddhism and began to practice that and study it. He began writing. You described him in high school getting an assignment where you have to write a poem, and he came to you and said, I have no idea. And so you, as a good mom does, you helped him write his first poem, but it became something that he loved to do. And also, in that period, he began to struggle with mental illness, which became an issue for the rest of his life, and which you write about very movingly and passionately. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the intersection of those things, those three things in his life.
It was very difficult to write about them. I had to disappear to Mexico for a month, in rural Mexico, and really study the issue of mental illness, study his poems, and immerse myself in his life in that way. And now even speaking about it, of course, it brings that up for me, but I felt like I needed to address, first of all, I needed to address the mental illness because that was such an important element in his life, and I probably didn't address it appropriately when he was alive. Yes, when he was 16, he suffered basically almost a mental breakdown, you could say. He ended up in hospital for a month, having suffered a deep depression. But then, after he came out, he seemed to be normal, and he was deeply involved at that point with the spiritual path of Siddha Yoga. The Buddhism came later, and he thought about becoming a monk or swami, and he really longed to be at an ashram, particularly the one I'd taken him to first in the Catskills, so that he could study more about this path. And so at that stage, he seemed to be fine. He was writing his poetry and living a very full life in the ashram, taking care of a man who was a paraplegic. And then he left the ashram, and after that things started to deteriorate. And then, of course, when he was living here in St. Pete, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he battled that for the rest of his life. And I'm not sure if I've answered the question.
No, I think you have. And I think the poems, as I read them, I see that both his love for that spiritual path, his pursuit of it, and his struggle with his own, with his own illness, with his own difficulties, and both the poetry and the spirituality, I think, became a way for him to try to deal with with that. Although also, as you say, he often tried to hide it too, is that the widow, the ex-wife, didn't know he had been diagnosed with mental illness, even though they were married. So,
well, in fact, she actually did not know about the mental illness until I told her after he passed away. She was devastated because had she known, her whole approach to him would have been different. But of course, she had no idea why his behavior was so erratic. So it was really sad. And of course, in retrospect, I probably should have told her, but I didn't feel like it was my business to interfere in these adults' affairs. So I didn't realize that she didn't know.
But the poems, the poems really, to me, seem to show him searching, for peace, for shedding the ego, all of those things. Bob, can you read one of them for us?
Sure. Did you say the name of the book?
A Leaf in the Wind by Jaro Majer and Rose Marie Prins.
And this poem, which is entitled, "In What Form Would I Like to See God?" is on page 11. In what form would I like to see God? O Lord of Lords, your form is all forms. Wherever my eyes may rest, may I see your love manifest. Wherever I set my feet, may your love and my love meet. It is at all times sublime. I wish for the grace to see this always. With no pride in being, there's humility in seeing. Without racing from it, I will embrace your being. Teach me, O Lord, to free my love and to see you as you truly are. Omana Shivaye.
Let's try it.
Oh.
The book, of course, is a combination of Jaro's poetry and your paintings, your artwork. And we were talking earlier about the painting right behind us. And this isn't in the book. This painting isn't in the book. But you said you started it right after his death. And the paintings in the book, what came first, the art or his poetry? Because you didn't get his poetry from her right away.
Good question. So I'll tell you how this whole project evolved, starting from the beginning. It had 3 different phases. The first one was, in 2016, before Jaro passed away, I received a grant from Creative Penales, and I decided this was my opportunity to do something I've always wanted to do, which was to go to India. So I made plans to go to an artist retreat in New Delhi and spend 2 weeks making art. And many of you have heard the story before, but on my way to New Delhi, my 23 tubes of oil paints were confiscated. And so I arrived without my art supplies. When I got there, I found that the soil on this property of the Sanskriti Kendra was an absolutely gorgeous golden color. And I decided that that was going to be my paint. So all I had to do was get myself some acrylic medium, which wasn't that hard to find in New Delhi. Although traveling in the city of New Delhi is always terrifying. That's another story. Anyway, so I got the acrylic medium, and I got some handmade Indian paper, and I adhered the soil to the paper, and then I went around the property and collected the leaves from the trees, because I felt a kinship with these leaves. I felt like those trees suffered through the pollution and the drought and the monsoons. They survived all of these things, and here was I, only at this stage, Jaro had possibly been gone about 3 months. So I was grieving very deeply. So for me, these trees represented some kind of model for how to survive in the world after you've lost the thing you love most in the world. And so I started taking the leaves from the trees and placing them on the ground, the soil, and then tracing around them, and then painting them in black with acrylic paint, black acrylic paint, which I had, which wasn't confiscated. And then that was phase 1, right? No plans for a book, just this obsession, I have to admit, obsession with these leaves. So I brought the leaves back against, whoops, I'm being taped, I'm being recorded. Somehow the leaves arrived back with me in the United States. And
stuck to the bottoms of your shoes, maybe.
And so that was phase 1. Then phase 2, one of my students, Trisha Tierney Moses, and I went off to Mexico to paint, to an artist retreat there. And this time I wised up and I did not take oil paints, I took watercolors. And so I started working on these watercolors right here, you can see them. And these are the watercolors that we find, the beginnings of the watercolors that were in the book. So while in Mexico, I just did these colorful grounds, which color is not my thing normally, but I just needed color. So I did all these colorful grounds. And then, at some point, I decided, while in Mexico, I decided to add the leaves. And that was 2017. Then, just before I went off to an artist retreat a year later in 2018, this was at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, I had the idea to include these images with Jaro's poems that I had received shortly after I returned from India, and make a book. And so while I was in Virginia, I started working on the book. And simultaneously, I was working on these paintings that you see behind me, just still obsessed with the leaves. I'd make a painting, and then I'd destroy it with something else so that I could add the leaves. And this painting here, as you said, I started just a few days after Jaro died, but I only finished it this past week because I had to add the leaves to make it complete. And now I'm looking at the painting on the floor here, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to be adding leaves to that too. I take the leaves and I cut them out of cardboard, and then I print them on with printing ink onto the mixed media surface. So I think that basically answers your question.
Yes, let me ask one short thing, and then we'll ask Bob to read another poem. But you said, I have to destroy something to add the leaves. What do you mean exactly by that? I think I know that some of your artwork involves blowtorches, so, you know.
Well, the painting that's underneath this painting here was shown here at Studio 620 on that wall over there, and it was called Mother India, and it was all these brilliant colors, because, you know, if you've ever been to India, there's just so much color. The women's clothing is all these brilliant, we would call them clashing colors, but somehow they just work in India. And of course you go to Mexico and it's the same kind of thing, color. And so I was inspired by that. particularly my experience in India, to add all these colors to this canvas. But frankly, after a while, I couldn't live with it anymore. So I took the soil, which is another of my trademarks. This is soil from the United States, in fact, and painted over almost the entire canvas with the soil, using the medium to adhere it to the canvas. And then you can just see, if you came up close, you would see a little bit of Mother India showing through the leaves, because I printed the leaves using the color, it's called, well, it's just a printing technique, again, with printing ink onto the leaves and then burnishing them onto the canvas. But you can still see a little bit of the color showing through the leaves. So that's how that evolved.
It's so interesting to me that that painting, and I remember that painting, is under that painting. And that it is so transformed, which goes back to that idea of the transformation of art. Anyway, Bob, would you like to read us another poem?
This poem is entitled, well, it's entitled This Very Moment, and it's on page 31. This very moment, my heart is wide open, like soft grassy fields, with no hills in sight. Ruddy roses line the edges, and the wind ushers them into a dance. Happiness abounds, like children's laughter and after-school play. Love fills this body, emanating from the depths of my being. I don't know where this energy comes from, but in this moment, it leaves me content, wishing for neither thing nor place. All outer darkness melts into splendor, like wax into the candle's flame. All tensions from toil disappear, and every feeling turns to light. This, like night to day, when the sun ascends the horizon, brings color and bright bird songs to a new awakening. The mind holds fast to this spring of joy, this breath of warming air. Lungs expand, and with exaltation exclaim, where else but here? What time but now?
You said that you had originally thought about doing 3 books, and then once you've done one, you decided one might be, just right. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the process that you use to choose the poems. First of all, you said you had both poems and journals. What made you decide to go with the poems rather than the journals? And then how did you choose these particular poems? And did you have a particular principle or method for organizing them? I know, having worked on anthologies myself, one of the things you have to think about is the order in which they, what do you want to do with that order? So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, first of all, in terms of the triptych, it was going to be, the first set of poems were going to be the spiritual poems, the second ones were going to be, the seventh book was going to be the secular poems, and the third one was going to be the prose. It's still a lovely idea, but it ain't gonna happen. But in terms of organizing the poems, it was almost a struggle to decide how they were going to be arranged, but I worked with my assistant, my girl Friday, Amanda Stonko, and we went through the poems carefully together and decided that the beginning poems were going to be the ones of searching, the yearning, the longing, the searching for the truth. And as the book evolved, and as the reader continues to read through the book, they get to the poems where there's a sense of discovery, of almost, yes, I would say completion. By the end, by the final poem, there's a sense that, yes, he found the thing he was looking for. And then, of course, we know that after that, after he'd done all that writing, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and he could no longer write because the voices interfered with his concentration. And so those poems became even more precious because they were just from that particular time in his life before the illness really impacted him. And in terms of how did I organize the art with the poems, that was again something that Amanda and I very carefully selected the works, the poems, and then the works. And because we had already established where the poems were going to be in the book, so it was a matter of finding out which works were going to go with which poems. And it's interesting because we almost without exception agreed, okay, this image is going to go with this poem, this one's going to go with this poem. So I think we're happy with the choices.
What made you make those choices? Can you talk at all about, with this poem, this one seemed right. Okay, what made an image the right image for a particular poem?
Well, some of the poems were searching and yearning, and I'd look at the leaves, or we'd look at the leaves, and we'd see this leaf reaching up for the sky. And I'm sure I've got that. One of them, for instance, would be here. It's kind of reaching up and out. This is queen's flower, it's searching. And others are more like contained within the page. So it was just a sort of dialogue that we entered into, and finally we get to this agreement of what came with what. But as I say, it was organic and it kind of worked.
Yeah, kind of the mood of the poem and as you say, the subject of the poem.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think they work beautifully. But I'm just I was interested in how did that come about? How did that work? Did you have, how many images of these images did you have? I mean, did you have a lot more images than poems, or did you have to make more images because you had extra poems, or?
Yes, in fact, there are 21 poems, and we didn't have enough images, or not quite appropriate images, so there are a couple that I discarded, and then I worked on more images. For the holidays last year, in fact, a year ago, to complete this whole series. So there were a few more images that were added. Let's see if I can find one of the more recent ones. So yeah, here's one that was, oops. This is one that came later. There's a slight difference in the technique, or a difference in the papers, because one is cold pressed and the other is hot pressed. So anyway, I like the variety it gave to the book.
Yeah. So for a few of them, you were right. That was made for a specific poem.
Exactly.
But most of the others you had done independently, and then kind of matched them to the poems.
Exactly. And then we would just look at a poem and decide, well, that one needs such and such an image, and we don't have that image, and so then I would set to work to make the image to go with the poem.
Bob, can you read us another?
This poem is entitled entitled Unity, and it's on page 47. My dear love, I want to fly into oblivion and never come back. May you enter me and take me over. O Guru Diva, a flow of love gushes from your eyes like a river spilling the banks of my rock-hard heart. Its muscular current smooths the surface of my being, then it dissolves this rock completely, and my being is scattered in your stream of love as it rushes to the ocean toward completion.
And Bob, just for a second, could you hold up the image that's with that poem? Just because we've been talking about that business of matching. I'm sorry, I'm messing up your bookmarks.
Is that with cameras?
I can probably hold that image up here.
Thank you.
Well, I can see it now. Good.
You've been making art all your life, so making art for this book wasn't a new experience for you in terms of processes and knowing what you were doing. But this is, as far as I know, the first time you've made a book that you've edited and put together a book. Is that right?
No.
Oh, okay.
I've actually made numerous books, but they're artist books.
Yeah.
So that's the difference between the kind of book I normally have made. For many years I've made one-of-a-kind artist books. It's a whole different thing. And I did one-of-a-kind artist book, which is currently at an exhibition, Arts Annual, at the Creative Analysis exhibition right now at Largo for award winners. And so that book, which includes one of the poems from this book, is in that show right now, and people can go see it. And as well as see all of these 9 of the original images that are framed and on the wall there, as well as the book. So if you happen to be in Largo and you want a book, you can go in there and purchase it. But so some of the images are there, some of the images are at the Maureen Arts Center, a couple are there in an exhibition, and 5 more are at the Dunedin Fine Arts Center at an exhibition. So the images have gone out into the world, and all I have left now, for the time being, are the prints. But I don't think I answered your question.
Well, those books, as you said, the art books are one-of-a-kind books, and they're primarily art. They're not primarily text or even 50-50 text.
Right.
This book, it's different from that. It is an art book, but it's also a poetry collection. And putting it together, and also it's not a one-of-a-kind, it's not a single edition, it's many copies that, that also you hope will go out into the world, that have already gone out into the world. Mm-hmm. So it's, something that people will absorb differently from an artist book that they see at an exhibition. This is a book that people will take home and, read in privacy and absorb in a different way. But I wonder what the process of putting it together, and I can remember occasionally you expressing frustration about that process. I wonder if you could talk about that process and about what surprised you about it, what you didn't anticipate, what that was like.
Right, well, they say how it takes a village to put together certain projects, and for me, it took a village. I had a lot of wonderful helpers who edited, made suggestions, and I couldn't have done it without them. Starting with this group here, right here in St. Pete, which is called Keep St. Pete Lit. I went on 2 Saturday mornings to their event, of course before the pandemic, when we'd sit around a table of a bunch of writers and critique each other's work. And so that was really helpful for me. And then the process continued from there. When anytime I bump into a writer, I'd say, hey, would you read this? Give me your opinion. And so by the time I finished, I felt like I had expressed what I needed to express, not with the kind of grace and brilliance of any of my favorite writers, but I'd say adequately. And while I'm speaking of my favorite writers, you all have to read Colette's story in Tampa Bay Noir, because it's really cool.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a very different tone from these things, but thank you very much. But your favorite writers, other than me, you were editing, curating a book of poetry. Were there any other poets, or any kind of writer, but especially poets, that you felt helped you shape this book, who you had in mind, or who inspired the way you put the book together?
Not directly, but one poet in particular has always resonated. Her poetry has always resonated with me for many years. And of course, she too passed away at an early age, and this is Sylvia Plath. I love her poems, and of any of the poets I can think of, she's the one whose work has moved me the most. And of course, there is a correlation, not in terms of what she was expressing, but maybe a little bit in terms of their lives, her life and Jaro's life.
Yeah, that kind of burning brightly and not long enough.
Right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting, Sylvia Plath. I didn't know that, but I'm interested to know that. There's a new biography of her.
Oh, I'll have to read that. Now, in terms of the other writers who were very helpful to me in this project, were people who wrote about mental illness, who wrote about their own experience of mental illness. Esme Wei-Jin Wong wrote a very, very moving book about her own experiences dealing with mental illness. Brilliant woman, brilliant writer. And had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And of course I read A Brilliant Mind. There was a woman who wrote The Center Cannot Hold, Ellen Sachs, again writing about her experiences with schizophrenia. And again, an absolutely brilliant woman. A professor who struggles still dealing with her schizophrenia. So those books are books that I wish I'd read when Jaro was still alive. I would have had a much better understanding of this illness and how it affects one.
Yeah, it seems to me that the book sort of has that intention, that is to bring attention to that. You know, not just to give people a sort of portrait of your son and to express your own feelings, but to bring attention to that part of his life as well, and to that problem, which is enormous.
Without a doubt. And that's why I wrote the afterword, which deals more directly and specifically with mental illness, to kind of you might say round the whole story off, you know, starting with somebody who had so much potential and who had intelligence and charm, and as you say, and also the good looks, and then having met with the sorry demise that he did was as a result of his mental illness. So yes, it rounded it off.
Yeah. It's sort of a crusade is too strong a word, but a way to make people maybe think differently about that. Yeah.
Without a doubt, yes. Yeah. Maybe we should hear another poem.
Let's.
This poem is entitled A Declaration, and it's on page 49. A declaration. Oops. In the expanse of this divine love, I am delirious. Forgetting all hindrances, I embrace a taste of the fullness that is your constant state of being. As your melting devotion caresses me, I am oblivious to egoistic cares, and I feel such confidence in the success of my spiritual pursuit. Every remembrance of you, my Lord, is laughing with me and bearing witness to the crumbling of the barriers of disillusionment. I offer my love to the world with this prayer. May I serve however you choose. May this puzzle be completed and, in full form, reflect the infinite formlessness of your sweet and loving being. I owe my life to you, my own essence.
This project was born out of loss, and I sort of hate the word closure, because it implies that you can ever close off grief. But people do find ways to live with loss. And I wonder if at some point in this process, at what point in this process, you might have felt that making this book and bringing it into the world helped you with that.
Without a doubt, it did help. First of all, it kept me busy, it kept me occupied. It kept me looking forward to my trips to Mexico, to India, wherever, which is past tense, of course, now. So it was all part and parcel of this process of grieving and moving through my grief. And finally arriving after years, arriving at a point of acceptance. And sometimes the smallest little thing will trigger a memory and I'll find my eyes tearing up. But I can now be in public without fear that I'm suddenly going to start sobbing. So yeah, I've reached a point of acceptance. I feel like, I know that it's in a better place.
I wonder if that's what you said, that when you were thinking of 3 different books, you thought of the spiritual poems, the secular poems, and the prose, the journals and things. And I wonder if that's what drew you to begin with the spiritual poems, that somehow that his pursuit of that became in a way yours as well.
The path that he was following at the time that he wrote this is still the path of yoga that I am on, very, very connected to that path of yoga. So I connected with these poems very viscerally, you might say, and there were more of them. The spiritual poems, it just seemed to be the obvious choice. You're right in that way, and many other ways it just seemed the spiritual poems were going to be the first ones. And yes, reading through them was both painful, because everything to do with Jaro in the beginning was painful, those memories, but it was also a necessary part of my healing. Yeah.
And the poems that you chose it seems to me, reading those poems, even though I know what I know about who he was and what happened and your loss, the poems themselves to me are so uplifting. They're about pursuing the spiritual, but it's a joyful pursuit. And it seems to me that maybe you've made that kind of transformation I was talking about before, that we draw things from loss, and you've drawn these very lovely poems, and you've made these very beautiful images, and that's perhaps the best way you could mark his life.
Yes, I think it's wonderful that he's left this legacy. When he was in New York, not long before he died, he participated in a poetry slam on the Upper East Side. They loved his poems. They loved both his poems and his delivery, and wanted him to come back and be the featured poet. And months later, maybe a year later, I asked, well, why didn't you pursue that? You had this opportunity, why didn't you pursue it? And he said, well, I didn't want to be known in that way. And so, in a way, his mother has decided that among a small group of her friends and associates, and etc., he is now becoming known in that way. And I feel fine with that.
Yes. Bob, can you give us one more?
Yes. This is actually the last poem. It's in two big bifurcated stanzas, so I'm just going to read the ones on the right side of the page. This poem is called Oh Dear One, and it's on page 51. Oh dear one, never ever give up hope on this path of the heart's subtle opening. Your goal is within, awaiting your presence beyond the dark nights and the eclipse of days of the soul. May you feel the strong pull of the deeper than emotion, subtler than the global commotion, source of your existence. The Guru's nectarine potion dwells in the central palace of the castle of your heart. From the beginning of time, like a spark in the dark glowing through all eternity with the fullness of bliss, may your dwelling be there forever. Oh, Shri Diva, your soul was fashioned and sent by the gods in heaven. Surely this is a fact, Hari. Remember this truth above all else. May the Guru's gift of love guide your sorrow's sweet end. There we'll sing and play in surging raptures of laughing contentment eternally. Much love, Hara.
I love that one. Rose Marie, do we want to see if there are questions?
Well, I would just like to add one word, or just one sentence to that. That's the last poem in the book, and his spiritual name, the name he was given when he was living at the ashram, was Hari. So, and that was Much Love Hari, because that's what they called him then. But I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah. Shall we see if there's any questions from folks here?
Yes.
Any questions?
we answered everybody's questions, or we put you to sleep. Yes, Kara.
After you've completed your project, do you feel, your collaboration with your son, do you feel that you have come to a place, what you obviously have, and you expressed that earlier, that you've come to an acceptance, and do you feel that you have peace in your life now with what's happened based on
That's a good question.
with your son?
And I couldn't say that I am at peace all the time. I still go through periods of remorse, of wishing things could have been different, of wondering what I could have, should have done differently. But it's not on a daily basis, it's not all the time. So, and when those thoughts start to arise in me, I realize that they're not helpful. There's nothing I can do about anything that happened in the past now. So before I couldn't, but now I'm in a place where I can push them aside and think of the good things. And today I heard a 3-year-old laughing in the background, Marcus's son, and tears came to my eyes because I remembered Jaro at that age and how wonderful he was and how, just what a treasure he was. And so things like that happen, and it's good. And I have my memories, and most of them are good memories. So in that respect, I've come to terms with my loss and have found peace. Yeah. Betty?
I just began wondering, have you put this technique away at rest, or will you continue to use it?
Did you hear that?
Yes, she said, have you put this technique away? I think you're talking about the artwork.
About the artwork,
Yeah.
the leaves.
The leaves. Or are you continuing to use it? Well.
Betty, I probably won't be doing the images that I did for the book, which are not typical of my work. They're more decorative, and I think they're perfect for the book. But I don't think I'm done with the leaves. I have them pressed, and they're in my studio. And I was just looking at this blue painting on the floor, and I was thinking, wow, I'd like to add some leaves to that. so I'm still involved with the leaf, which is typical of me. I tend to explore any topic until I've reached a point of, well, maybe not closure, but a point of moving on, where, okay, now I can put this aside and move on. So I did this series called Bound Crosses and Boundary Crossings, and I worked with crosses, the Christian crosses like crosswalk, whatever. I just explored crosses for the longest time until I worked through that, and then on to the next project. So that's what I do.
So the leaves are still with you for a while, at least.
I think so. The leaves are with me, yes. Be careful, folks. I'll be coming around and printing leaves on you. But they're all the Indian leaves. They're all Indian. They have names like Tree of Sadness and Krishna's Buttercup and Devil's Tree and Queen's Flower and Bodhi Tree.
I know those names are wonderful. That's what in the book, that's the names of the artworks are the names of the leaves. And I love those names. They're poet. Those names are poetry.
They are.
Maybe you already said this, but what drew you to the leaves?
I'm sorry?
What drew you to the leaves?
Oh, I like that question because I didn't really answer it entirely. I said about how the trees on the Sanskriti Kendra were surviving in spite of the drought and the horrible pollution and all the rest. But I did have an epiphany very shortly after I arrived at the Sanskriti Kendra. It was sunset, and so it was almost dark, but as I walked on the property, yes, there were stars in the sky, in fact, yet in spite of that, without any visible source of light, there was a lotus bloom, one lonely lotus bloom, blooming in a pond, and it seemed to be illuminated from inside, from within, and that was an epiphany. It was like, oh my, wow. It was just one of those experiences, and that is the thing that propelled me to get totally involved in this project, and to put aside the project I had planned on working on when my plan was to do something completely different in India. Yes?
So apologies if you already said this, but do you have a leaf, so you said the leaves that have names, do you have one you're most drawn to personally, and then one for your loved one? So are there leaves that have names that you're most drawn to for yourself personally and for your loved one?
You know, the leaf, of course, because of this experience with the epiphany, was the lotus leaves. And the lotus leaf didn't survive the trip from India to the United States. They disintegrated. So that's the one I actually no longer have. But I think because of the meaning of the lotus in the spiritual path of yoga that I follow, and that my son followed at the time, I think that poem for both of us is probably, I mean, that leaf is for both of us would probably be, even though of course it was a flower that gave me this experience, I was dealing with leaves, so that lotus leaf, the circular leaf, became would you call it the icon for the project? And of course the book, the cover of the book does not have the lotus leaf on it, that's a different leaf, but yeah, I think that leaf would probably be, if I were able to consult with my son, he'd say, yeah, that's it. But then of course other Bodhi tree and Krishna's buttercup. Krishna is the name of the blue god in Hinduism, and he's often referred to as Hari Krishna, and of course my son's spiritual name was Hari, so Krishna's buttercup is a close second. Yes?
It seems to me that your entire life's work is about healing. That's how I see it, healing. Your early works were about the ripping apart and then sewing together. And this seems to me about healing also. Would you say that that's what your life's work is about?
I think you're right, yeah. Sometimes I'm addressing the environment. For instance, I did a series of about the Florida Springs, and it wasn't just, oh, look what we're doing to the environment, how it's being degraded and polluted by humanity. I'm also looking at the other side of it, how we can work together to correct these things, how the Florida Springs could be restored to their pristine quality if we all got together and joined together with one focus. So yes, that, I mean, regardless of whether I'm doing something that really relates to me personally, as did the Bound Crosses and Boundary Crossings, which was all about growing up in South Africa as a white person, in that so-called Christian country. And so that was my attempt to heal the wounds that one inevitably experiences when one lives in a master-slave society. It doesn't matter whether you're on the master class or the slave class, there's still wounds for both sides of that dichotomy. So yeah, I think you're right.
Was there another? Yeah, I thought I saw it.
Can you provide additional context behind your process in choosing the title for the book?
I didn't hear the first part of the sentence, but
Could you give the context for choosing the title of the book?
you know, that's another good question, because I found out after I chose the title that in fact there's lots of A Leaf in the Wind out there. You know, there's several books with A Leaf in the Wind, and that's why...
You can't copyright a title, that's an interesting thing.
Well, my book is called, or our book, as I like to say, is called A Leaf in the Wind, Poems by Jaro Majer, Artwork by Rose Marie Prins, and that's the only one out there with that particular title. And the reason I chose that title was, first of all, I was working with leaves long before I knew, or quite a while before I knew I was going to be writing a book. And, you know, if I think about my son's life, he was very much a leaf in the wind. You know, he was tossed by circumstances, by life circumstances, hither and yon. And like a leaf, his life was short. So it seemed the most appropriate image as an image for this book and as a title for the book.
Any other questions? Rosemary's book, Rosemary and Jaro's book, is here and available for sale, and I think you will sign them if folks would like. Is there, for those who are with us virtually, can you tell them where they can get the book?
Certainly, thank you. You can get the book at the Mauryan Arts Center here in St. Petersburg. It's in the gift shop, and currently at the Dunedin Fine Arts Center until this current show comes down, which will be just before Christmas, and also at the gallery at Creative Pinellas, which is in Largo, and that show will probably be up, I just heard, until sometime in February, so the books will be there until then. So if you wanted to just pop in there and pick up a book, you could do that. However, the easier way, for if you're not heading off to Dunedin or Largo, or even downtown St. Pete, would be to go online. You can go to my website, which is www.rosemarieprins.com, and go to the portfolio, A Leaf in the Wind, and you can find both the book, and you can find images, digital prints of the book, of the images in the book. For instance, this is one, the same size as the images in the book. So those are available both on my website and at Bella Unica's website. So that's www.bellaunica.com, and you'll find the book and some prints on that website as well. And currently that's about it, but that gives you several options. And we do have books for sale right here at the studio at 620. And I just want to add my deepest gratitude to the folks at the studio at 620, both Bob and Marcus, for staging this event. And great gratitude to Colette, not only for being my student for forever, but for doing for just being so great in every way, both as a painter, as a writer, as a friend. Yeah, she's terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone who came and who joined us virtually. And I will be back in your class in January, and I'm prepared for the possibility that you will be printing leaves on whatever I'm painting. But that's good. That's fine. And thanks to all of you, and thanks to Rose Marie for being a wonderful teacher and friend all of these years, and for bringing this beautiful book into the world. Thanks to all of you.